Greetings people, welcome to week 7. We're looking at the Ottawa Charter and the development of the new public health. This is an advertisement that was in the Weekend Australian, some 2005, but we can still find similar advertisements appearing to this very day. And you can see that there's the Australian Government Department of Health logo at the top, senior management roles in big type, and then just underneath that it says primary healthcare, senior management roles in primary healthcare. Now I'm sorry the text is not particularly clear, but in the first paragraph the second sentence says a number of exciting director executive level 2 opportunities are now available for enthusiastic and committed individuals in the primary care divisions. It goes on, the main goals of the division are to ensure the quality, accessibility and cost effectiveness of primary care in Australia. The division is large, complex and dynamic and comprises 4 branches: the primary care policy branch, the budget and performance branch, the general practice programs branch and the primary care programs branch. So why is the heading at the top primary health care when the positions are about working in primary care, about dealing with primary care? Why is the word health in the top part of the title? My belief is the word primary health care is there to bastardize primary health care, to render it meaningless. This is an attempt to say, yes, we've got primary health care, and they merge it and blend it with primary care as though the two terms are identical. They're not identical. So truth in advertising would say these are senior management roles in primary care. Then if that's the case, that's what should be stated. It's deceitful to advertise primary health care when you're talking about primary care. So health is a game of politics, and I mean politics in the battle of ideas. Health is about the battle of ideas. The health arena is about the battle of ideas, about how to manage, how to control, how to predict, how to do whatever. The use of the term primary health care is to present as though we have all of these things happening when in fact there's no change whatsoever. It's business as normal, primary care as normal. Let's just dress it up with a new name. I think we finished the previous lecture on primary health care with these next 2 slides that said that when primary health care was first announced at Alma-Ata, it was seen as a potentially liberating, it was seen as a almost revolutionary idea. Universal availability of basic health services, and it was seen to be a potential positive, a potentially good thing. But within less than 12 months, in 1979, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health suggested that comprehensive primary health care was too complex, too expensive, too difficult, and that it would be better to have a more limited set of health problems, and they suggested this thing called selective primary health care. This was to be low cost, easily implemented technologies, and David Werner argues that this was the beginning of the end for the broad social justice approach to primary health care. Throughout the Third World, primary health care was stripped of its social change-seeking content and diluted into selective primary health care. And again, its unifying focus on equity and community participation were replaced by a few quick-fix technologies. The dream of changing the world was reduced to the doctrine of changing behaviour. So let's just have a look at selective and comprehensive primary health care. Selective primary health care focuses on diseases that have the highest prevalence of morbidity, that have the highest risk of mortality, and have the greatest possibility of control in terms of cost and effectiveness of the intervention. Selective primary health care, on the other hand, is comprehensive primary health care, on the other hand, considers health is not merely the absence of disease. Rather, health is defined holistically. Health is considered to be about equity. Multisectoral or intersectoral approaches are considered to be key to improving health, and the community's involvement is critical, and the involvement here is active involvement. Active involvement as a subject rather than passively as an object. Put these things into a table and look at the differences. Comprehensive primary health care is about equity, it's about participation, and intersectoral or multisectoral. Selective primary health care uses the language of economics. It's about effectiveness, it's about efficiency, and it's about cost benefits. Comprehensive primary health care is horizontal in a sense. It relies on linkages, it relies on community support and action, it relies on community capacity. Selective primary health care is vertical, it's top down. And success depends on management arrangements and support rather than on community action and community capacity. The times for comprehensive primary health care is a long-term perspective, whereas in selective primary health care the focus is on short-term objectives. And this satisfies the needs of donors and program managers and funding cycles who have these short-term funding cycles, so you constantly need results that can be looked at for the next funding round. The actors for comprehensive primary health care have been the World Health Organization, whereas selective primary health care was favoured by UNICEF, who came up with the GOBI 3F plan that we'll come to in a minute, and the World Bank has also become a key player in international health. In comprehensive primary health care, the sector-wide approaches, so-called SWAPs, are favoured, whereas for selective primary health care they tend to be specific disease type structures. So Gavi is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation, and then there's Global Fund to Fight AIDS, a Global Fund to Fight TB, and a Global Fund to Fight Malaria. So specific funds dealing with specific diseases rather than dealing with a sector-wide approach that is favoured in comprehensive primary health care. So GOBI became one of the big activities under selective primary health care, and GOBI stood for growth monitoring, oral rehydration therapy, breastfeeding, immunisation. So these were the first four components of selective primary health care. But then they added a few more because a report drew attention to women's conditions. So family planning, food supplements and female education were added, and we ended up with GOBI FFF. So growth monitoring, a relatively simple activity, low cost technologies, regularly measuring an infant's growth, intervening as necessary. Oral rehydration therapy we'll come to again in a minute, we talked about in our previous lecture. It's estimated that oral rehydration solution saves more than 4 million children a year. So again, relatively simple, relatively inexpensive, relatively easily managed. Breastfeeding, of course, breastfeeding remains the ideal form of nutrition for for infants and young children, for a whole range of reasons that I don't need to go into. Immunisation is another important part of selective primary health care, immunisation can protect children against measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, tuberculosis and polio. At the moment, it's estimated these diseases are killing more than 5 million children a year and leave more than 5 million children disabled and become major causes for conditions like malnutrition. So those four components were the original components, and then the next three were about three kinds of support for women. So family planning, because evidence shows that having a 2-year space between children produces a better outcome. Food supplements are about acknowledging the importance of antenatal nutrition, the importance in achieving a good-sized baby, and one that can manage with the rigours of life. And female education. Even within low-income communities, a child born to a mother with no formal education has been shown to be twice as likely to die in infancy as a child born to a mother with 4 years of schooling. And again, the statement I keep making is the major predictor of a child's health in a developing country is mother's level of education. So GOBI FFF. Now, each one of these actions has a whole lot of choices about the way it's actually presented, about the way it's actually delivered. I used this diagram before talking about primary health care. And again, this is simply about rehydration solution and showing that there are various ways they can be offered, various ways the program can be delivered. And depending on your choice of delivery method, a lot of consequences follow. So the key one they've got here is about dependency, and at the extreme left of the continuum is dependency on high technology, institutions, all of those types of things, professionals in control. At the extreme right of the continuum, we have self-sufficiency, where control is in the hands of the family actually using the material. So again, it seems relatively simple just to say, well, let's go with oral rehydration therapy, but then there are lots more choices that need to be made that influence the long-term availability, the long-term consequences for the sustainability and the success of the program. Now, primary health care was diluted in developing countries, so instead of comprehensive primary health care, selective primary health care was seen to be the way of funders, etc. In the developed country, the so-called industrialised countries, primary health care was considered to be third world health, was considered to be something that happened over there. It was considered to be something that was of no value for developed countries. We have a water supply, we have wonderful hospitals, we have wonderful nurse education centres, we have everything in our system is just wonderful, just brilliant. We don't need to think about this form of care. We're managing very well, thanks very much. And so we come to the Ottawa Charter, and the Ottawa Charter, the front page says that the conference organisers wanted to use the platform of the Ottawa Charter as a major step towards developing a new public health. And this new public health would be dedicated to the maintenance and improvement for health for all. Now, health for all was the slogan, was the catch cry that came from primary health care and the Alma-Ata Declaration. The Ottawa Charter was a refinement or a development of the Alma-Ata Declaration. It's not something totally different. What it's actually trying to do is trying to re-profile, re-spin, re-badge primary health care so that it is seen to be relevant for developing countries. This little bit says that the document was achieved, the Ottawa Charter was printed, and it was presented on the final day for everybody to consider. So this the Ottawa Charter was seen as a way of making primary health care appropriate for developed countries, and that was the initial impetus. But the new public health begs the question, what happened to the old public health? Now we could spend the rest of your degree doing nothing but focusing on public health. Public health is a huge area, and one of the famous definitions comes from a very well-known writer on public health, John Last, who says that public health is one of the efforts organised by society to protect, promote and restore the public health. Public health activities change with changing technology and social values, but the goals remain the same. An exam question. Describe the history of public health from its origins to the present day, concentrating especially but not exclusively on its social, political, economic, religious and philosophical impact on Europe, Asia, America and Africa. Be brief, concise and specific. It's not really an exam question, but it is trying to say that public health in its own right is a huge field. It's an area of study in and of itself, and we're doing an immense act of violence in glossing over public health just in this one session today. So I acknowledge that public health is a huge and established area. The old public health. From medieval times until well into the 20th century, public health strategies relied upon an overtly coercive element, attempting to force citizens to behave in ways deemed most appropriate for the interests of the state via legislation. So this is from the work of Peterson and Lupton, two writers who examined the new public health back in the 1990s, and they remind us here that public health can be coercive because the power of the state can be used against an individual if the state considers that to be in their interests. So people often get a warm fuzzy feeling, talk about community health or the public health as though somehow they're generally nice, positive descriptions. But in fact this reminds us that there's force, there's coercion, and legislation can be used against the interests of individuals, and public health has always been like that and continues to be like that. Disease causation has not always been well understood. There's been various theories, various beliefs about what causes illness, what causes deaths. So we have a fairly sophisticated view here in the 21st century, but we haven't always had that view. So here we have a picture of angels flying around firing darts at random into people. We have disease and pestilence being poured down upon an undifferentiated mass. We just have these angels of vengeance taking their reward on a population, and there's little that can be done about it. So it reflects a particular view of the about health and illness and death at a particular time. We move into a woodcut done around about the time of the plague. We have burials, we have large percentage of populations dying. We don't know, they didn't know why they were dying, they didn't know why some were saved. But here we have them burying bodies from some mass event. Again, some of the early care provided was through male church members, brothers, priests or whatever, and also through women, through nuns, through various religious traditions, offering of services, but there was little that they could offer. And here we're using a cross to try and provide solace to somebody who's dying. So again, very difficult to understand, very difficult to know how to address or how to deal with these conditions. Large numbers of people were dying, uncertainty about how, what, why, what causes all of these things. Death was seen to be walking around the countryside, taking people at random, taking people at will. There was little you could do about it, little you could do to prevent it, little understanding of what the causes were. One of the big things in public health has been the quarantine. So quarantine was set up because it recognised that diseases were being transported from one place to another place, and they were often transported in ships. So this took some time for a ship to leave one port and get to another port, and they could carry diseases as they went there. Of course, now we have modern travel, we have air transport, and a person can go from one side of the world to the other side of the world in 12 hours, in 18 hours, in 24 hours. So we now have highly mobile disease processes that were not so mobile back in the 1700s, 1800s. This is a famous attack on a quarantine establishment that occurred in the United States, I think in 1850. I think this looks like 1858. I think this was on Staten Island. And again, there was a lot of hostility towards quarantine because people saw a lot of the diseases coming across with sailors, with whoever. Lots of the language were about people carrying these infections from places to places. So the idea of quarantine was to put a new arrival aside to make sure they weren't carrying any problematic conditions for the local population, and then they were allowed out into the wider community. And we still have quarantine functioning to this very day. It remains a major defence about the transmission of various conditions. So the old public health battled the so-called infectious diseases, so things like cholera, leprosy, bubonic plague, syphilis, smallpox, diphtheria, streptococcal infections, dysentery, typhoid, typhus. These were the conditions that the old form of public health were trying to address. I love this description. This is from a letter of Erasmus to the personal physician of Cardinal Wolsey in English household of the 16th century. And it's a description of floors in the kitchen. As to floors, they are usually made with clay, covered with rushes that grow in the fens, and which are so seldom removed that the lower parts remain sometimes for 20 years, and has in it a collection of spittle, vomit, urine of dogs and humans, beer, scraps of fish, and other filthiness not to be named. One can only wonder at the smell of places where 20 years of the collection of these things is just allowed to develop. It must have been unbelievable. And certainly it evokes not a nice image to me. So public health dealt with those infectious diseases, and then we have the modern old public health that became the history of great men. The history of public health became that of great men, and the way they addressed infectious diseases through the development of sewers, through the building of wells and the control of water supply, by declaring dwellings as fit or unfit for habitation, for looking at recreation and sports grounds, for checking on public baths and gardens, and for looking at things like food adulteration. So public health became reduced to these particular actions. John Snow. This is one of the great men that are seen as one of the leading figures in public health and specifically in epidemiology. So John Snow is known as the father of epidemiology, and he's particularly famous for the Broad Street pump. And the Broad Street pump was a water supply in Broad Street, in Soho, in London, where people from the surrounding areas drew their water from this particular pump. One of the cartoons of the time show people pumping water out of the Broad Street pump into buckets, into containers, to then carry back to the house for use within the house. Now, there was a cholera outbreak that occurred, and John Snow, for the first time, sat down and drew on a map where deaths occurred and where they drew their water supply from. And he was able to show an enormous number of deaths occurring clustered around people who had drawn water from the Broad Street pump. And the story goes that John Snow understood that the water in that pump was causing cholera, and this was before an understanding of germ and bacteria had developed. So he knew it was causing it, but he didn't know why. So his solution was to go down and remove the handle from the pump. And that's seen as one of the great public health acts. The removal of the handle from the Broad Street pump meant people couldn't pump their water from it, and because they couldn't pump their water from it, then the cholera rate started to decline in that area. So the history of public health suddenly becomes his story, suddenly becomes the history of great men, and here's the great man John Snow, the father of epidemiology, who went down and removed the handle from the Broad Street pump, and then we have the story. The counterside to the history of great men is to say that there were women involved. There were women who were equally influential. But sadly, the nature of our time is to ignore or downplay or not take account of women's stories. So here we have Florence Nightingale, and years ago we would have spent a lot of our degree time just looking at Florence and at Florence's writings. But people are less familiar with Florence now than they were certainly in my day. So this little bit says it's true that Florence's main claim to fame was nursing British soldiers during the Crimean War. What most people don't know, however, is that disease during that war killed 10 times more soldiers than the war itself. Disease during that war killed 10 times more soldiers than the war itself. Florence, who had been endowed with a love of mathematics and epidemiology by her father, noticed that there were correlations between the sanitation and ventilation of the soldiers' quarters and the rates of disease. After the war, she and a colleague prepared a lengthy statistical report which was presented to the British government and was instrumental in resulting in improvements to sanitation in the army, in hospitals, etc. Her work was one of the first uses of applied statistics towards a concrete end. And what an end it was. Literally millions upon millions of lives have been saved by the statistical study into hygiene and sanitation that she began. So it's important from my perspective as a nurse to use this slide as a corrective, to challenge the view of public health as the history of great men, and to reinstate Florence in her rightful place as certainly the mother of epidemiology, whose role has been overlooked merely because she's a woman. So this slide is my corrective slide. A couple of years ago, I met a new colleague who came to the School of Nursing and Midwifery from the United Kingdom, Elaine Lodge, and she saw this slide and she said, "That's good, Jeff. Have you got anything about Mary Seacole in there?" And I said, I don't know Mary. Who's Mary? And she says, everyone knows Mary. And I said, I've never heard of Mary. And she said, well, Mary Seacole was known as the Black Florence Nightingale. And she was once the best known woman in England. She was a Caribbean doctor who had travelled widely and was able to put her skills to good use in the Crimean War. Due to her race, she was denied the opportunity to work with Florence Nightingale. She travelled to Crimea on her own to minister to wounded British soldiers. There she established the British Hotel. Thousands of them remembered her with gratitude and with affection. When she returned to England, she was once again shunned by the white nursing establishment. Yet at the time of her death, she was the most famous woman in England. Queen Victoria even published a bust of her, even commissioned a bust of her for the palace. Mary published her memoirs, known as The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. So I now have to have two corrective slides. I have to have a slide for Florence to correct the reliance on men, and now I need another corrective of Mary Seacole to say that this woman, because of her race, her story has been repressed and suppressed. And certainly when I went through nursing in the 1970s in Australia, in Tasmania, there was no mention of a black Florence Nightingale in the stories that I heard about nursing. So the old public health. White notes that medical groups were hostile to sanitary reforms that were going on because they saw them as unscientific and as against the interest of the medical profession that was developing at the time. So there were various views about what caused diseases. Miasmas of bad air. Smells were considered to cause disease. Bad smells were considered to be a main factor in disease causation. And indeed the story is that London's sewer system was built not because they understood the importance of separating sewage from water, but because they were trying to remove the smells from the city. And it was only the byproduct that was actually useful in a public health sense. So germs weren't well understood. We didn't have the germ theory as it was then. Hereditary was another explanation. So in the genes, and bad blood was the other method, or the other belief that was around at the time. And this was why they used to use leeches and use cupping, and why they would drain people's blood. And that was seen as a positive treatment, and is represented in the red and white striped poles of barber shops, remembering that barbers and surgeons were the same thing. In 1882, Robert Koch understood and developed something to do with tuberculosis, and Holman, a West Australian public health expert, says the germ theory had the effect of narrowing the focus and mandate of public health to the identification of infectious agents and control by isolation, disinfection and mass immunisation. So once the tubercle bacillus was discovered that caused TB, it narrowed the focus of public health even more than it had been before. And then in 1909, Paul Ehrlich came up with a remedy for syphilis. And Meredith Tertian, in her excellent book on public health, said germ theory was successful in finding a medical cure, an event that inaugurated the era of searches for the magic bullet, the one tablet that would solve all of these problems. So public health went through a bit of a period of reductionism when the focus was reduced and narrowed to be just about these infectious diseases. At the same time, clinical medicine was developing cures and surgeries and hospitals and were being successful in developing diseases. Public health, in a traditional sense, in a notion of broader public health interests and in hygiene, were in decline. And then we have Ottawa Charter and Health for All by the year 2000 that was to try and reinvigorate, restart all of these things and move away from the focus we've had on high technology curative services. Peterson and Lupton again notes that the new public health encompasses concepts and strategies like health promotion and health education, social marketing, epidemiology, biostatistics, diagnostic screening, immunisation, community participation, ecology, health advocacy and health economics. All of these are relatively new areas and are used in conjunction with or have supplanted older methods. So the new public health that took off in the 80s and 90s after the Ottawa Charter drew on all of the new areas that were developing in society, in universities at the time, and that these all had things to say about improving the population's health. I'd forgotten that drum roll was there, and that surprised me. Here we have the Ottawa Charter, and this is actually a copy. This is actually a picture of my copy of the Ottawa Charter, and it's a well-used copy that I've had for many years and I still refer to. And it shows that the Ottawa Charter was the product of three organisations: the World Health Organization, Health and Welfare Canada, and the Canadian Public Health Association. It was developed in 1986, developed in 1986 at a conference in Ottawa, Ontario in Canada, and the diagram, the logo is there, that tries to explain the Ottawa Charter. There is a link on the Milo site for week 7 that actually has a paper that explains why the logo has taken this form, and you're welcome to look at that. So the Ottawa Charter, there are 3 health promotion strategies: enable, to mediate and to advocate. So these are strategies for health workers to use in working with the community, to enable, to mediate and to advocate. And there are 5 key action areas of the Ottawa Charter: build healthy public policy, create supportive environments, strengthen community action, and to reorient health services, and to develop personal skills. So, build healthy public policy, create supportive environments, strengthen community action, develop personal skills, and reorient health services. These are the 5 key action areas of the Ottawa Charter. Now, the create supportive environments, we'll actually spend some time on this semester. Nancy Millio is here. Nancy Millio is a very famous nurse who was a professor of nursing and a professor of social policy in the 1970s, 1980s. Did a really interesting book on tobacco and cigarette smoking. And she argued about the supportive environment, that the idea is to make the healthy choice the easy choice. Make the healthy choice the easy choice. The implication of that, though, is maybe we should make the healthy choice the only choice. And this is a debate that's constantly coming and going about the nanny state and about the role of health promotion. Does it restrict individual freedom? Is that what we should be doing? So, Ottawa Charter, 3 health promotion strategies, 5 key areas. Let's play with this a little bit. In 1981 in Australia, a campaign started with a seagull called Sid, and it was about preventing melanoma skin cancer. And it started off with the slogan, slip, slop, slap. It sounds like a breeze when you say it like that, slip, slop, slap. In the sun we always say, slip, slop, slap, slip, slop, slap. Slip on a shirt, slop on sunscreen, and slap on a hat. Slip, slop, slap. You can stop skin cancer, say slip, slop, slap. Now, that's now been modified, and the modification is at the top there. Slip on a shirt, slop on the sunscreen, slap on a hat, seek shade, slide on some sunnies. So the saying now is slip, slop, slap, seek, slide. Now this is a really important campaign. What it relies on, though, is it relies on individuals changing their behaviour. It relies on individuals, probably mothers, to take responsibility for their children, to ensure that the kids are dressed appropriately and that they have sunscreen on. So this requires the parent, the carer, to ensure that if they go to a swimming pool, they take all of the equipment necessary so that a kid can minimise their exposure to the sun. Now, if you've been at a swimming pool with some young kids, you'll know that they're in and out of the water, in and out. And keeping sunscreen on them is no easy task. So Slip, Slop, Slap, a really important campaign, started in 1981, relied on changing personal behaviour, relied on people taking responsibility, buying the appropriate clothing, making sure kids had hats, making sure sunscreen was available, all of those types of things. The first part of the campaign was about changing personal behaviour. But now we have environmental change, and the change that has happened over the past 20 years, certainly in many places in Australia as you drive through, you will find public pools now have shade cloth. So shade cloth is now used to provide shady spaces for kids. Not only for kids, but shady spaces for people using the pool. So here we don't need to worry so much about slip, slop, slap because we actually have shaded area available. So in 2009 in the newspaper, the headline was, "New research shows shade in schools has positive impact on adolescent sun habits," and it says, "A new study published in the prestigious British Medical Journal reveals for the first time that students will use, not avoid, shade if it is made available at their schools. Students will use, not avoid, shade if it is made available at their schools." And over on the right hand it says, while more research is needed to identify the factors that will maximise student use of shade sails, the results of this study suggest that by simply changing the environment around students, it can change their behaviour. So Slip, Slop, Slap relied on individuals taking action, changing their behaviour, and parents making sure that their kids were appropriately clothed, had hats, had sunscreen, had all of those things. This part, though, is saying if we put shade in, it's a natural thing for kids, for people to get out of the midday sun. They will choose shaded area. So here we are modifying the environment. We no longer need to preach to people because they will seek the shade. So some of the things that have occurred with skin cancer has been schools insist that kids wear hats, not allowed out to play if they don't have hats on. Some schools have changed their sports time and their swimming carnival time so that they don't occur in the peak exposure time during the middle of the day. So they'll have their sports or swimming earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon, and avoid those 10 to 2, those critical 4 hours of sun exposure. So by modifying the environment, by modifying activity times, by planting trees in schoolyards, we can have the same effect as the Slip Slop Slap campaign. One relies on personal behaviour, on advertising, on admonishing, on getting kids to remember, on all of those things. The other method doesn't rely on any of that. It relies on people's comfort. They will naturally migrate to shade to get out of the sun. Oh, the modern car, one of the great stories of our time. Increasingly we are using cars for transport. We are sedentary. We can lecture people. We can say you should get out and walk, and on the left we have a woman crossing the road. Again, where does the message, what type of message? Do we rely on people changing their behaviour, or do we try and do things in a different way? Again, the Ottawa Charter, the elements that are important here. At the time I prepared this slide, there was a bike ride promoted for Tasmania to improve the community's health. And I thought that's a good idea, but if you followed the link, you'd found that it was actually sponsored by McDonald's, and McDonald's actually produced a brochure saying, look, it's really good that you're going for a ride, so why not call into McDonald's before or after the ride? And we can see that they even produce a map with a diagram so that you can find your McDonald's after you've done your healthy bike ride. The Ottawa Charter. On the right we have some cigarette advertisements that are no longer allowed to be shown in Australia, but the advertisements have been defaced. So the top advertisement has been modified. The taste of stale farts, new, a vile and a bore, and the bottom one has anyhow have a Winfield and lose a lung. So these have been defaced by health activists, by an organisation known as Bugger Up. Billboards utilising graffiti artists or whatever it stood for. People took action under the Ottawa Charter of creating a supportive environment and argued that it was right to deface, to destroy, to damage cigarette advertisements because the greater good, the public health, saw that as a good act. Now, Simon Chapman, who is the Professor of Health Promotion at the University of Sydney, was a key activist in this area in the 80s and 90s, and he certainly has a lecture, a PowerPoint, talking about this particular campaign, and that's available on the Milo folder. Car accidents. This is a car accident that I attended the people in to a couple of years ago, so that's my Land Cruiser in the background, and I stopped and looked at this car because I'd treated the guys who had been in the car a day or so before, and seatbelts are often not worn in Central Australia. So one of the consequences, one of the efforts that was used to try and deal with car accidents was the use of seatbelts. And seatbelts were put into cars not by the health system, but were put in as a requirement of legislation that said cars from this particular period will all have to have seatbelts in them. And then over time cars have to have seatbelts, it became law to wear seatbelts. So this is using the legal system to try and enforce a behaviour that has positive health consequences. But it was addressed not through the health system, but through the transport and legal system. I'm not sure this campaign ran in Tasmania, but it was another campaign that certainly ran last year, and it was to try and undercut, to try and ridicule the male, the macho, the speeding, etc. So it was a pun to try and undercut the seduction of speed and power and males that goes on. So this is another campaign trying to influence a mindset. So last year, a Formula One driver, the Formula One race was in Melbourne last weekend. A Formula One driver was booked for driving his car and doing wheelies, and he went to court, and it was considered to be a poor role model. So the heading was, "Don't be a dickhead." I think he escaped a fine, but again it was to try and get people to think differently about behaviours that we've always had. This complex little diagram, an ecological framework, is not dissimilar to the work of Yuri Brofenbrenner that you're covering in CNA 145. This article is also on the Milo site for this subject, 126, and it shows in the middle there that we have individual factors, small scale, micro, and that's about cognitions, in this sense attitudes, preferences, knowledge, values, skills, lifestyle, biology and demography. And then around the individual we have in this model the social environment, the social network, and that's talking about family, friends and peers. Then the next setting is the yellow ones, about the physical environment, and here we're talking about home, we're talking about work, we're talking about school, we're talking about neighbourhoods, we're talking about all of the things in the environment. And then at the larger level, macro level environment, here we're talking about social and cultural values, about food and beverage industry regulations and licensing. We're talking about food marketing and media. So if we understand this is about the influences on what people eat, then it allows us multiple places of intervention. So it may be that you may spend your time working on the individual factor, and that's traditional health education, giving an individual more information, more knowledge. It may be that you choose to work on the social environment, that you choose to work with family, friends and peers. It may be that you choose to work at the physical. These provides a whole set of choices about where actions can take place. And this is one of the advantages of the Ottawa Charter. Sorry, that's just me slurping a drink. About the Ottawa Charter, because it allows us multiple ways of intervening. And this here shows us that it's not just the individual. And we've been playing with that all semester. We've played with that with our food log, we've played with that with Supersize Me, we've played with that with the nutrition information, that it can be just down to telling a person you should change your diet, but it's the same thing as you should wear sunscreen. How else can we modify things so it doesn't rely on the individual to change their behaviour? And this particular picture here will be useful in doing your assignment at the end of the semester about applying the Ottawa Charter, and here it's showing you some of those places where that charter can be applied to affect behaviour. So health promotion. Health promotion is the science and art of helping people change their lifestyle to move toward a state of optimal health. Optimal health is defined as a balance of physical, emotional, social, spiritual and intellectual health. Lifestyle change can be facilitated through a combination of efforts to enhance awareness, change behaviour, and create environments that support good health practices. Of the three, that's enhance awareness, change behaviour, and create environments, of those three, supportive environments will probably have the greatest impact in producing lasting changes. And that was written in 1989. Supportive environments will probably have the greatest impact in producing lasting changes. So what is health promotion? Health promotion is the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. It is a positive concept emphasising personal, social, political and institutional resources as well as physical capacities. And that definition is from the World Health Organization Health Promotion Glossary, and this is this is a picture of the Health Promotion Glossary. It's available on Milo. It's dated 1990, and some people will say that's now out of date, but it's useful because it provides a definition for all of the key terms relating to the Ottawa Charter and health promotion. So in a sense, to ensure that we're all singing from the same songbook, it's useful to get your definitions and understandings from here, because it ensures we all have similar views. So avoid looking up a general dictionary, avoid looking up a medical dictionary. Use this health promotion glossary, because it means we all then will have a similar understanding of the words, and some of the areas of confusion hopefully will become less and less over time. So the health promotion glossary is available online. By all means use it. And so we come to the medical model in the work of Ron Labonte, a Canadian public health promotion advocate. And he says about the medical model, for much of the last century, the dominant concept of health has been influenced by the disease treatment model. And the medical model is dominant in the sense that it is the one imbued with scientific, professional and institutional authorities. It is by no means the only model, and it has been argued that it does not describe how most people view their health. So the medical model works on a series of diseases, so cardiovascular diseases, cancer, AIDS, diabetes, obesity, mental disease, hypertension, etc. The next approach that Labonte talks about is behavioural approach. And he says health, from the behavioural risk factor perspective, moves beyond disease prevention by incorporating notions of promoting physical and emotional well-being. Health determinants become synonymous with healthy lifestyles. Program actions add educational, behavioural, psychology, social marketing and policy theories alongside medical theory. And now they change from diseases to things like smoking, poor eating habits, lack of fitness, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, poor stress coping, lack of life skills. So here the problem is seen to be in the individual and in the individual's behaviours. The third model, and the model we're interested in, is the socio-environmental approach. Labonte says the expansion of health thinking in the 1980s led to the incorporation of a sociological and environmental analysis of health and disease. Some of the reasons for this shift from a lifestyle approach to incorporate social and environmental determinants of health included a recognition that most lifestyle improvements occurs principally among better educated, more privileged members of society. Research indicated that healthier lifestyles were often low priorities for people living in poverty, who are unemployed, or in low-paying, low decision-making jobs. Further, health education campaigns were accused of victim blaming, both in their content, e.g. bad eating habits, smoking cigarettes, lack of exercise, and indirectly by their focus on personal behaviours at the expense of a broader consideration of social and environmental contexts in which personal behaviours are embedded. So under this approach, we now have conditions like poverty, unemployment, powerlessness, isolation, pollution, stress, hazardous working conditions. I tried to get a picture of an upstream downstream, but I'm not overly happy with the picture. I'll find another one at another time. So here we have a table showing us the medical model, the behavioural model and the environmental model, and showing us that the medical model focuses on diseases, the behavioural model focuses on behaviours, and the socio-environmental model focuses on socio-environmental type conditions. So we have cardiovascular disease as a medical condition, we have smoking being seen as a problem behaviour, but we have poverty over here. Now my argument is that the socio-environmental is upstream and the medical is downstream. If we can intervene at the socio-environmental area, then the behavioural and medical ones cease to be a problem. So again, from the health promotion glossary, health promotion involves the population as a whole in the context of their everyday life, rather than focusing on people at risk from specific diseases. So, selective primary health care focuses on people with specific diseases. Comprehensive primary health care has a wider focus. Health promotion here is about working with people in their everyday life rather than focusing on people who are just seen as risk factors for a specific disease. Health promotion is directed toward action on the determinants or causes of health. This requires a close cooperation between sectors beyond healthcare, reflecting the diversity of conditions which influence health. Health promotion combines diverse but complementary methods or approaches, including communication, education, legislation, fiscal measures, organisational change, community development, and spontaneous local activities against health hazards. Health promotion aims particularly at effective and concrete public participation. This requires the further development of problem-defining and decision-making life skills, both individually and collectively, and the promotion of effective participation mechanisms. Health promotion is primarily a societal and political venture and not a medical service. Although health professionals have an important role in advocating and enabling health promotion is not a medical service. And so we have barriers. This is from the work of Rob Moody and Elizabeth Pisani. Rob Moody was the director of the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation. I'm not sure if he's still there or not. He was tied up in the problems with the Melbourne Storm, and problems with rugby over payments or something. So I'm not sure of his current position, but he's always produced interesting work. So Rob Moody and co argued about health promotion that key barriers have been and continue to be the vested interests of the political, business, medical and academic establishments. The vested interests of political, business, medical and academic establishments. Given that the determinants for health are inextricably linked to political, social and economic realities, their identification is likely to clash with the interests of one group or another. Further, when the group that is being antagonized is in a position of political and/or economic power, the protection of their interests often take priority over the improvement of population health. So the first International Conference on Health Promotion occurred in Ottawa, Canada, and dealt with health promotion. The second International Conference on Health Promotion occurred in Adelaide in 1988 and addressed healthy public policy. A couple of years ago in my office I had every paper delivered at the second International Conference on Health Promotion. I had a huge bundle of papers and I was keeping them for posterity. A colleague tidied my office up and threw them all out. But to be fair, no one has ever asked me for a copy of a paper delivered at the conference in Adelaide. The third International Conference on Health Promotion was held in Sweden in 1993 and was about developing supportive environments. I became disillusioned with the Ottawa Charter process in 1997 when the fourth International Conference was held in Jakarta, Indonesia, and was co-sponsored by Coca-Cola. So I became disillusioned at that stage and haven't followed it as closely as I probably should have. The fifth International Conference on Health Promotion was held in Mexico in 2000. The sixth International Conference on Health Promotion produced a document known as the Bangkok Charter for Health Promotion in a Globalized World. So these have followed on from the first International Conference, and you're welcome to look at all of those and the developments that have occurred. Ilona Kickbush has been a major writer and a major player in the area of health promotion, and the Ottawa Charter itself believes that we're now facing the third public health revolution. The first public health revolution addressed sanitary condition and fought infectious diseases. The second public health revolution focused on the contribution of individual behaviours to non-communicable diseases and premature death. The third public health revolution recognises health as a key dimension of quality of life. Health policies in this century will need to be constructed from the key question posed by both the health promotion and population health movements. What makes people healthy? The third public health revolution recognises social phenomenon as well as biological and psychological ones. The new public health, the new component, understands that community action has been necessary to achieve change. The change that has occurred over history to do with public health has not been because great men have done it, but because communities were active, were involved, were key players. So the third public health revolution recognises the role of people, the role of community, and says that social phenomena are as important as biological and psychological ones. Ilona Kickbush asked the simple question, where is health created? It's not created in offices, it's not created in hospitals, it's not created in doctors' surgeries, and it's not created in universities. It's created in the context of everyday life, love, play. It's created